Joanna on satellite quenching and relation between quenching and structure.
Thank you. So as you said, I'm Joanna Wu from the ETH Zurich, and I will talk to you about satellite quenching in relation to structural change. So there are lots of things we already know about quenching, and we already heard a little bit of an introduction. So there are several things with which quiescence is correlated with. So for example, morphology and quenching are strongly correlated. And this is one example of many, many examples of studies that have shown that the quiescent fraction of galaxies is strongly correlated with any measure of morphology you can think of, where the quiescent fraction increases if you are morphologically early type. We also know that morphology is correlated with the environment. So we've known that for a while as well, where disk galaxies tend to live in less dense regions, and morphologically early type elliptical galaxies tend to live in dense regions. We also know that environment is correlated with quenching. So here I'm going to slow down a little bit and tell you a little bit about what I have done. So there is a lot of work also done on environment and quenching. And here I and my collaborators decided to look at the importance of the environment and quenching correlation versus the importance of the morphology and quenching relation. So here, this plot shows on the y-axis one measure of morphology which we use, which is sigma 1, the stellar density within 1 kiloparsec of the center of a galaxy, versus halo mass, which is going to be my measure of environment here. This is for central galaxies. And this plot here is colored by the specific star formation rate. The SSFR, as you can see, increases quite strongly, or decreases, quite strongly with this measure of morphology. And it also decreases weakly with the halo mass. So let's look at this in more detail. SSFR is, as we know, a bimodal quantity. And this color scale is just the median of the SSFR. So let's look at the entire distribution of SSFR here in one strip of halo mass. And this is from the Yang et al. Catalog, by the way. So I've plotted the distribution of SSFR as a function of increasing sigma 1 as you go to redder colors. And so as we go up here in this strip, then you can see that the SSFR distribution, the star-forming peak goes down and the quenched peak goes up. You can do the same exercise with a strip of constant sigma 1. And as the redder histograms are higher halo mass. So as you move towards higher halo mass in this strip, you see that the entire distribution doesn't change shape, but moves gradually towards lower SSFR. So we suggested in this paper that one interpretation of this could be that the quenching that is associated with halo mass gradually moves SSFR downward, whereas quenching that's associated with higher sigma 1 might be a more sudden or a more dramatic process. But the question that I want to focus on today is, what are satellites doing? So the question is, how does morphology evolve as satellites quench? So we have seen in many papers, including Fang et al. And Edmund Chung here also has shown that the SSFR is strongly correlated, or color, is strongly correlated with this quantity, sigma 1. This is the density within 1 kiloparsec. And of course, we have seen with many other papers that any measure of morphology is strongly correlated. So in the sense that star-forming galaxies have a wide range of morphologies, whereas quenched galaxies have a smaller range of high sigma 1 or early type morphology. So the question is, what are the satellites doing? Now we know that several mechanisms for quenching satellites are expected to happen regardless of their morphology when they fall in. So we might expect naively that the satellites might occupy most of this diagram without the quenching satellites and the quenched satellites might occupy most of this diagram. So the question is that actually what we see? So let's look at the results right away. Again, I have here on the y-axis the SSFR from the Brinchman et al. Catalog, and on the x-axis our fiducial measure of morphology. And just so you know, we did check that other measures of morphology produce the same qualitative results. So this is the distribution in the SSFR versus sigma-1 plane for the field galaxies. And as we've seen before, the star-forming galaxies occupy a wide range of sigma-1, and the quenched galaxies here are at a small range of high sigma-1. And this is the distribution of satellites in the sigma-1 versus SSFR plane. And what you should notice, the first thing you should notice, is that the color scale here represents number density of objects in the plot. And you can see right away that the satellites have a higher quenched fraction than the field. So that has been known for some time, and you can see it very clearly here. But the quenched fraction isn't the only picture for quenching. As we saw in the previous slide, the entire distribution of SSFR actually contains a lot of information about quenching. So here you can see that the shape of the distribution here in this plane does change with environment. So in particular, so I've shown here that the vertical line is the same in both plots, and it marks roughly where the green valley is in the field. And what you should see right away is that the bridge that connects the star-forming population to the quenched population, this green valley, has shifted over to lower sigma-1 for the satellites relative to the field. Another feature you can see is that the star-forming population is slightly elongated in the satellites relative to the field, so that the actual mean SSFR for the star-forming population is slightly decreased. Another feature is that the quenched population is slightly elongated also towards lower sigma-1 for the satellites relative to the field. So let's look at these features in more detail. So here I put the panel back here, SSFR versus sigma-1, the same information we saw just now. And I take the star-forming population, the green valley, and the quenched populations, and plot here their histogram of sigma-1. So the blue histograms are the satellites, and the black ones are the field. And what you can see here is that what I highlighted earlier, the green valley for the satellites is skewed towards lower sigma-1 relative to the field. The quenched galaxies also are skewed slightly towards lower sigma-1, but not as strongly as for the green valley. So what you should see here is that the green valley has lower sigma-1 than the field, but not only is it lower than the field, it's also the distribution of sigma-1 is very similar to the distribution of sigma-1 for the star-forming galaxies. So if the green valley represent those galaxies that are being quenched, they seem to be being drawn from the entire distribution of star-forming galaxies, the entire distribution of sigma-1 from the star-forming galaxies, and moving down to the green valley, taking from the entire distribution. However, the quenched galaxies, even though the quenched population of satellites is at lower sigma-1 than the field, they're still at higher sigma-1 than the star-forming or green valley. So they're still weighted towards higher sigma-1. So I just told you about the x-axis of the SSFR versus sigma-1 diagram. Now let's look at the y-axis. So what I plot here is SSFR versus stellar mass. This is the main sequence. This is for the star-forming galaxies, where the satellites are the solid line and the field galaxies are the dotted line. And you can see here that there is a small but systematic shift in the SSFR for the satellites relative to the field. There's a shift, you can interpret it as a shift downward or a shift leftward, or both. And we can talk about the shift leftward later. But you can see that the same thing is seen in the quenched galaxies. Now this is very interesting because SSFR for quenched galaxies is probably not actually SSFR. It's based on D4000, so you might consider it as a measure of age. But whatever it is however you want to interpret this quantity, SSFR for the quenched galaxies, there's a systematic offset relative to the field. So that's rather interesting, and we have to think a little bit about how to interpret what this y-axis really means. Okay, so far we have looked at the field versus all satellites, but we can divide the satellites further into different environments. Now, I and my collaborators showed some time ago that for the satellite population, two measures of environment are important. group-centric distance or cluster-centric distance of the satellites versus the halo mass. And here you can see that this is colored by the quenched fraction, not the SSFR. And you can see that both of these quantities matter. You have to be at low group-centric distance in order to have your strong correlation with halo mass. And you have to be at high halo mass in order to see your correlation with cluster distance. So here at low halo mass, you don't have a very strong correlation of quenching with distance. So both of these quantities matter. So what I did was I divided this plot into 4 quadrants, and I plotted the SSFR versus sigma 1 diagram in these 4 quadrants. Okay, so this is far from the center, low halo mass, far from the center, high halo mass, close to the center, low halo mass, close to the center, high halo mass. So those 4 quadrants are exactly what these panels are. The SSFR versus sigma 1 diagram in those 4 panels, in those 4 quadrants. And you can see the same features that we saw earlier. This vertical line is the reference for the field, the green valley position in the field. So you can see that the green valley is still shifted relative to the field in all 4 environments, and you can see a little bit of a stronger shift in higher halo masses and perhaps also at lower group-centric distance. You can also see that the quenched fraction increases dramatically like we saw in the previous plot. So what we noticed here is that, okay, we've got these 2 somewhat orthogonal measures of environment, but what we noticed was that the position of the green valley seems to vary with environment like the quenched fraction does. So what you can do here is you could take the quenched fraction in each panel so that you can collapse 2 orthogonal measures of environment, characterize them by one number, the quenched fraction each panel, and see where the median sigma 1 is relative to that quantity. So again, so this is what I plot. This is the median sigma 1 versus the quenched fraction. Now this quenched fraction is each of these panels. You can do that also for the field, not just for the satellite panels. Okay, so this panel, this point here, this quenched fraction, 0.4, that refers to the quenched fraction of the entire panel. And then each of these other points are these other panels. Okay, so that's the x-axis. And on the y-axis, then you can plot the median position, the horizontal position of the sigma 1. And these colors represent different masses where this is low mass and this is high mass. So what you can see here is that the position of the green valley correlates smoothly with this measure of environment, this one number that I'm using to describe 2 quantities, the distance and the halo mass. So I've done the same exercise. This was just for the green valley. I did the same exercise also for the star-forming population. So this is the star-forming population, the green valley, and the quenched population. And you can see that the scales are the same. The variation, you see a slight variation also in the mean sigma 1 for the star-forming population and the quenched population, but it's not as strong as the variation in the green valley. You can do the same exercise for median SSFR, not just sigma 1. So sigma 1 was the x-axis, now we're looking at the y-axis. And the SSFR, now this information is similar to what I showed about the main sequence of the satellites decreasing for relative to the field. So you can, when you divide it up into different environments, you see the same decrease. It's a little noisier because there are fewer star-forming galaxies in these really high-density environments. But it's still there. The decrease is still there. You can also see the same decrease in the quenched galaxies. Again, you have to satisfy to yourself how to interpret SSFR for quenched galaxies. But there you have it. There's a systematic decrease. So in summary, the SSFR sigma 1 diagram is useful for a useful diagnostic of satellite quenching. And the features of this diagram seem to vary smoothly with the environment, where if you take 2 measures of the environment and describe them by one number, the quenched fraction, you find that the features vary smoothly. And so, in other words, you can predict the distribution of SSFR versus sigma 1 if you are given stellar mass and the environment. The features of the SSFR sigma diagram that vary are the position of the GV bridge for satellites has lower sigma 1 than the field, and that the SSFR of the main sequence satellites is lower than the field. One thing that remains common across all environments, however, is that sigma 1 for quenched galaxies is always higher for the quenched galaxies than for the star-forming galaxies. And so, finally, one last thing. Why is it that sigma 1 for quenched galaxies is always high? So we have thought long and hard about this, and we have come up with a couple of explanations for why that could be. So one reason is that something causes sigma 1 to increase for satellites. So, but you'd have to have it such that you have to quench first, and then you increase your sigma 1, according to this diagram. So one example of such a mechanism would be ram pressure compression. We normally think of ram pressure as a stripping mechanism, but you can also get ram pressure to compress gas to the center of a galaxy and form stars, increasing sigma 1. Such a process can start at about half an ReV, but you need a gas fraction of about a half, which might be unrealistic for Green Valley galaxies. Another mechanism that could do this is tidal compression. We know that in the inner parts of a halo, where the slope of the halo is low, is shallow, the tidal forces are compressive. So you can get you can increase your sigma 1 by a factor of 2 if you have a gas fraction of only 0.1. However, this only becomes efficient at 0.1 ReV, and we see this Green Valley effect at farther distances away. So it's still uncertain if this is what's responsible. But there are other scenarios and other effects that we can imagine in which individual galaxies don't actually increase their sigma 1. So for example, one way you can get high sigma 1 for quenched galaxies, even though the Green Valley is low, is tidal stripping. So what you can do, so here is the same panel, but for the next mass bin up. And if you'll notice here, the Green Valley is also at low sigma 1 relative to the quenched population, but the value of sigma 1 here is exactly the same as the value of sigma 1 of the quenched population of the lower mass bin. So what this scenario envisions the galaxies starting to quench, then getting tidally stripped such that their mass decreases by quite a lot and they end up quenched at the same sigma 1. So sigma 1 has not actually changed in this scenario. Obviously also, there are other scenarios, including progenitor bias, in which the reason why you have a high sigma 1 when you're quenched is because you quenched at high redshift a long time ago when the universe was denser. The Green Valley then only reflects the fact that the environmental quenching is only starting to become important now. So in principle, you can test between these two types of quenching, or these two types of scenarios to explain high sigma 1 simply by studying the stellar populations of recently quenched or quenching satellites. You can ask the question of how much the inner stars, what's the fraction that formed recently? And so I have been thinking about this question, and I do have some preliminary results that indicate that, at least for one galaxy, that there is a significant increase in sigma 1 of the in one particular satellite galaxy. But I'm still looking into more galaxies to see if I can distinguish between these two classes of scenarios. Thank you very much.
One quick question for Joanna.
Just a quick question. Why did you say that ram pressure compression starts at half of the radius?
So this is Deckel et al. In preparation. So maybe we should talk about that maybe later.
Okay. So, another question. We have time while the next speaker sets up. No. So I have a question regarding because you have the quenched galaxies. If I understood properly, the quenched galaxies in the clusters have a wider range of sigma 1, right?
Yes. Well, no, actually, if you remember that, what I had found was that the width was actually very similar, but it's shifted slightly towards lower sigma 1 for the quenched galaxies.
Okay. So this is telling you that in fact you have both mechanisms that you explained are at play, right? So the low sigma 1 probably are just. Did you look at these galaxies? Are they just red spirals, for example, without any bulge, or?
I haven't looked at them in detail, but I do plan to see what's going on with these galaxies.
Okay.
They are slightly shifted. They're not. It's definitely not as big a shift as the Green Valley. So
but some of them
in
look
general,
like they are in the
still-
same sigma 1 value that start forming galaxies at least, no? Or they're I don't know.
Well,
It's
the
just an
star-forming
visualization.
galaxies have a wide range of sigma 1.
That's right. But
Yes.
some of them look like the highest sigma 1 of the star-forming galaxy.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's just they look like spirals, red spirals or something like that. This would be interesting.
You mean at the low end of the
That's
sigma
right.
1. There is a tail,
That's
so
right.
it would be interesting to see what those galaxies are, I agree.
Okay. So let's thank Joanna again, please.